kind of a challenge I would have to anybody who watches the Is Genesis History movie. When one side presents their argument, it sounds compelling until somebody comes and cross-examines them.
While we all felt that Del and Danny's special night of stargazing together could go on forever, the film's parade of PhDs had to continue to the Oriental Institute Museum and archaeologist Douglas Petrovich.
So this picks up these events we've been looking at in Genesis, from creation and the flood, and now we're to the dispersion of mankind out of Noah and his family.
Exactly. And the dispersion would have taken place somewhere in this mountain range to the northwest of Mesopotamia.
Why not use the name, the Mountains of Ararat? Most Bible enthusiasts would recognize that from the Noah story. People are less bored when they hear things they recognize. Less bored, at least.
And what we see in the biblical text in the narrative is that a number of people have migrated down to southern Mesopotamia, the land of Shinar.
I can tell already that this segment is going to be largely devoid of scientific claims. So if I put on my biblical exegesis hat for a minute, I'd point out that Genesis 11:1 says that the people moved eastward to Shinar. And you just said they went south to Shinar. I understand you may have reasons for this, but you're speaking in a film that says that strictly literal interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2 is the only possible correct interpretation, with all others being false. I'm curious why a more flexible interpretation is okay for the latter chapters. For the record, ministries like Answers in Genesis completely disagree that Shinar or the Tower of Babel was in the south, so even young Earth creation camps are in disagreement about this point. And therefore all the speculation we're about to hear.
And that's the famous Tower of Babel.
Absolutely.
It's not so absolutely for other believers, but I'm just here for the science.
Do we know where that is?
There are about 7 or 8 Babels, cities of Babel, in the ancient area of Mesopotamia. And so one at a time, I've studied all of those areas and found only one that meets all the criteria of the famous site of the Tower of Babel, and that is the site of Eridu, which is in southeastern Mesopotamia. We have signs of the expansion to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west, all the way as far as Egypt.
Okay, so basically he's saying there are civilizations in all directions from the spot he picked. But what about this spot? Or this spot? Or this spot? They all seem to work. Is his proposed Babel site some kind of obvious epicenter, or is it totally arbitrary? But don't worry, this is an archaeologist. I'm sure he'll show us evidence.
And when you say evidence, that is the artifacts that we find in these archaeological digs?
Exactly. There's an enormous amount and very specific kinds of material culture that attest to this expansion of people that I'm connecting to the post-Babel dispersion. Here are the bevel rim bowls, these two.
These bevel rim bowls are an interesting phenomenon. The precision uniformity of shape and size across tens of thousands of these bowl finds, coupled with the relative difficulty to achieve this specific shape by hand, leads archaeologists to point to these bowls as possibly the earliest mass-produced product that we know of. There's even some evidence that these bowls were used as currency. Archaeological consensus agrees that these bowls originated in Uruk, so if we accept Douglas's assessment of the Babel location, then this seems consistent. That said, the bowls were mass-produced in and around Uruk. The dispersal of the bowls fits patterns of trade, rather than indicators that the manufacturing spread throughout the world. Doesn't quite fit the confusion scenario.
And because we see language, or the written expression of language, just pop up out of nowhere.
I'm not sure what pop up out of nowhere means to Douglas. Certainly the earliest examples of writing are the earliest examples of writing. Just like earlier in the film, when Dr. Ross tried to pretend that life appeared suddenly in the Cambrian, he selectively ignored all the more basal life forms from eras earlier than the Cambrian. It seems Douglas is ignoring all the archaeological finds known as proto-writing. These man-made markings use symbols and patterns for numbers and ideas, even though they didn't have a formal syntax. Examples found in graves in China date back to 7000 BC, before Dell thinks the Earth was created, as are the Vinca signs in Serbia from 6000 BC, and the Despilio tablet from Greece.
And then different languages being represented through cuneiform script or through hieroglyphic script or other means. So you do not have a universal plan that's followed among all of the languages. You see great diversity in the forms of grammar from language to language, even in ancient languages.
This is great stuff. I could make a career out of this guy. You see how clever this part is? How it doesn't require a shred of proof? And most paranoid delusions are intricate, but this is brilliant.
This is part of what makes stories like the Tower of Babel entirely non-falsifiable in the Genesis literalist mind. Any evidence that cultures influenced each other, like the beveled bowls, is seen as pre-tower commonality. Any evidence that cultures developed independently of each other, like very different language features, is seen as the hand of God confusing things.
So all of this fits perfectly with what we would see as the biblical account.
If something's the same, it fits. If something's different, it fits. Easy. I guess I could be a biblical archaeologist after all.
Of how languages took place. It's really the only way of explaining this.
It's the only way of explaining it? How about modern language splits and formation like Italian, German, French, Spanish, and English? Did God cause a second Tower of Babel event in Europe this millennium? Or was it just geographic diversity, separation, and cross-pollination with travel and trade?
So the integrity of biblical history ultimately is justified by the expression of these languages.
Provided that you ignore the ancient proto-writing samples, maybe you could find justification. You'd also need to assume that civilizations like the Chinese, Egyptians, and Mayans were pre-flood, then got interrupted by the flood, and then went right on back to the same language, cities, and cultures without mentioning the pesky flood interruption.
Now, most of us think today of a tower, the kinds of things we see in big cities, big straight walls. Is that what they were building?
Is that what they were building? Is a very well-worded question from Dell. This will allow Doug to speak factually about ancient Middle East structures, and it will sound like they can be attributed to the story of Babel. When we think about Atlantis, we think about bubbles and domes and technology. What kind of structures were they building in 1600 BC? That's the same thing.
Well, essentially it's a variation of a pyramid, and there were 4 sides to it and several stairways that would go up to the top.
It's called a ziggurat. I'm really confused by your unwillingness to throw out jargon.
At Eridu, we have a temple that existed in 18 different phases, and in every phase it grew in its size and its complexity. And that final temple, that final phase of the temple, it was abandoned immediately, right at the time of the late Uruk expansion.
There are innumerable reasons why a building project might be abandoned in any century. A miraculous intervention by God isn't exactly necessary for this kind of mundane happening. But incomplete structure would be a necessary marker for an actual Tower of Babel, so good for you.
Catacorner to the temple was an absolutely enormous platform.
Do you think that could be the foundation of the Tower of Babel?
Absolutely.
Wait, why is this absolutely?
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
You were just talking about an 18-phase ziggurat that halted completion. That was pretty close to the original story. Why are we moving over to the empty lot next door? Genesis 11 says nothing about a second tower. If you're looking to affirm the story, what about the handful of details we do get? Brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. If the building materials match, tell us, Doug. That would be a great confirming detail. Verse 8 says they stopped building the city. Not just the tower, but stopped building the city. Are there other incomplete structures in the city? That'd be corroboration. And that would mean that there are no structures in the city newer than the incomplete tower, right? Does that match your findings, Doug? Again, that would be corroboration. I have no idea what this empty pad is supposed to tell us.
Absolutely. We can move forward to the time of Abraham because we know that Abraham lived at the site of Ur, which was also in southern Mesopotamia, at the end of the 3rd millennium BC.
That brings us to the end of Genesis chapter 11.
Exactly. In fact, you see some pottery, some cuneiform tablets, all dating to the period of the 3rd dynasty of Ur.
Okay. You're just showing us things that existed in the approximate time and place that the story of Abraham took place, right? None of these things actually corroborate any element of the Abraham story.
It's amazing just as we're sitting here thinking about that, thinking about Abraham and that this represents the culture and the civilization that he lived in. It's a great tie to that record in Genesis.
Okay, let me repeat that for you. We know that Sherlock Holmes lived in London in the 1890s. Here you have a pipe and a newspaper dating to that time. It's amazing thinking about Sherlock Holmes and that this represents the culture he lived in. It's a great tie to that record in the novels. We know that Spider-Man lived in New York in the 1960s. Here you have a Mickey Mantle baseball card and a tie-dye shirt dating from that time. It's amazing thinking about Spider-Man and that this represents the culture he lived in. It's a great tie to that record in the comic books.
It is fascinating, and it gives you a feeling of putting your hands around the events that go on in the biblical text.
The events in the biblical text? I didn't hear anything affirming any Genesis events. We heard about some bowls, written languages that looked different from each other, one structure that may or may not have been unfinished, and pottery that happened to exist at the same time a story was written. That's it. There were very few science claims in this segment, but the historian didn't really even present history. And that's all for me. For the final Is Genesis History Science segment, select the video on screen now hosted by SciStrike over on his channel, or tap on the playlist to review the entire series in order. Roll credits. Thanks for watching. Later.